What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. It's been a while since I've sat down to record a proper video for the channel, and has also been approaching, I want to say 2 months or so since I actually finished Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey, which I'll be talking about in today's video, of course. And so while I have taken copious notes, I may be feeling a little bit less attached to the game in question, and therefore will likely approach this video a little bit more casually than I otherwise would have if I was fresh off of my playthrough. Those of you who have stuck around on the channel for a while might remember a few years back I did a video talking about how I could not seemingly get into mainline Shin Megami Tensei. And the games I dabbled with were SMT4, SMT3 Nocturne, and SMT Strange Journey Redux. Of course being the 3DS enhanced version, quote unquote, of the DS original, which I'll be discussing today. Now, as of recording this, I have finished all 3 of those games and am a healthy number of hours into SMT5 Vengeance. So I have a much broader frame of reference when it comes to mainline than I would have if I had recorded this immediately following my playthrough, but I'm going to try to keep the discussion compartmentalized because I do have intentions of doing a video on SMT4 and at least one, if not maybe even multiple videos on Vengeance once I finish that up, which will likely take a while because that game is just jam-packed with content. Anyways, for a little bit of background on Strange Journey, nothing too crazy because I tend to not prefer to delve into the development side of things when it comes to my videos. I just kind of like talking more so about the product that is in our hands. What I can say is that Strange Journey is clearly much more of a throwback title to the Super Famicom days than it is a follow-up and progression of what Nocturne set in place when it comes to mechanics and systems and all of that. So I kind of look at Strange Journey as being a somewhat more modernized and accessible in some ways version of the Super Famicom titles. And as someone who doesn't have very much experience with those Super Famicom titles, it was surprising to me those few years ago when I was dabbling with some of the mainline entries that Strange Journey Redux was the one that clicked with me the most. And because I had familiarity with Redux prior, I think I played a good 40-ish hours. I know I got to the end of Sector E, and that was at the end of the 3rd section of the Womb of Grief. And so because of that familiarity that I had with Redux, and the seemingly growing sentiment that the 3DS version is inferior in some ways to the DS original, I decided that would be my approach for finally playing this game in full. This way I would have a frame of reference to compare the 2 versions in some ways, and I would be playing the supposed best version, which seemed like a good plan, kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone in that way. I'm going to try to save any late game narrative spoilers for later on in the video once I've talked about all the other aspects that I want to talk about, but there are some things that I'll be discussing prior to the more heavy spoiler section that could be considered spoilers, like who the alignment reps are and how these games tend to work structurally or narratively or how that might mesh into the gameplay. So I just wanted to dish out that warning just in case. Megaten, at least barring Persona, is a very niche franchise that when discussing the non-Persona titles especially, I just want to be sensitive to potentially spoiling things for people out of the blue. Which I guess brings me into an aspect of this game's identity, being that I've seen some confusion over whether or not this is a mainline title. And I want to say many others have concluded that it in fact is, though development-wise it may or may not have started as a spin-off, and part of the questionable mainline status is because it doesn't take place in Tokyo. There's some other things like that that I've not been able to verify, so I would definitely recommend going and looking into that if you're curious about the definitive truth on the matter. But my conclusion that this is in fact a mainline title is because it retains the Shin Megami Tensei branding specifically in all regions, whereas their early Persona titles and Devil Survivor and Digital Devil Saga and even I want to say Devil Summoner all had the Shin Megami Tensei branding attached to them when localized to the West, despite these games not actually being Shin Megami Tensei games specifically. Rather, that was done in an effort to add some kind of brand recognition, which is sort of funny because I don't know that SMT was a very well-known name 20 years ago or whatever. I certainly had no wherewithal about it. Not that I would have been allowed to play any of these games growing up, even if I wanted to, but all of those are technically their own series underneath the Megami Tensei franchise. I feel like the closest comparison is probably Mega Man, where I guess you would consider the classic titles to be mainline, although I don't feel like anyone really refers to them that way. But of course, you know, you have the X series over there and the Zero series, and while those 3 series may take place in the same timeline, for instance, they are still considered separate series. And then of course you have Battle Network and Star Force and Legends and all of that underneath the umbrella. Some of these series only having 2 or 3 entries, like on the Megaten side of things, Digital Devil Saga or Devil Survivor, right? I just think it is interesting that people are so staunch about considering SMT to be mainline when, once again, I don't think you would say the same thing about like Mega Man Classic, for instance, even though that may technically be true. I have no objection to referring to SMT as mainline. I've actually gotten quite used to that. It's just that referring to a lot of these other series in the Megaten umbrella as spin-offs when in reality reality that they are just their own series in the franchise is like a little bit weird, especially when one particular series in the franchise has overtaken the mainline series in terms of popularity. Though I've been a big proponent of saying that Persona is many people's gateway into mainline, so anyone being an elitist or gatekeeping about mainline or some of the more hardcore titles, quote unquote, needs to like relax and realize that for many players, including myself, I maybe would never have even touched a mainline title if I hadn't played Persona prior. And that Persona, if anything, is just putting more eyes on mainline to begin with, which I think is a good thing overall. Though I do understand the frustration when it comes to Persona getting all these spin-offs and such, compared to mainline, which just doesn't get that many releases that frequently. Then again, if you look at the quality of a lot of these Persona spin-offs, I don't think you necessarily want that for mainline. Plus game development getting more expensive and taking longer just generally. And so with that pedantic ramble out of the way, the aspect to Strange Journey that strikes me the most is its story premise and alignment reps. And so when it comes to the premise of the story, the gist of it is humanity seems prosperous but is actually going to shit. And during said shit show, an anomaly appears in the middle of the South Pole. This anomaly, which scientists name the Schwarzwelt, seems to be expanding. I want to say it's the governments of the world or whatever get together to form this joint project in order to investigate and ultimately stop this anomaly from engulfing the Earth. And so the plan is scout out the Schwarzwelt with drones to kind of see what they're up against, although much of what they see from the drone shots are unbelievable because it's like a shopping mall, a landfill, and a red light district, and it's like, how could this possibly be? This looks like places that could maybe be on Earth. The joint project sends in 4 ships with the best of the best medical staff, soldiers, researchers, etc. and so on, and the latest and greatest technology as well as weapons. Now, before delving into the Schwarzwelt, you're introduced to the major characters, and this is where maybe there's some light spoilery kinds of things when it comes to these guys, but nothing too major. The characters you're introduced to are Commander Gore, Lieutenant Zelenin, and does Jimenez have a title? I don't know. Gore, Zelenin, and Jimenez are effectively the alignment reps for Strange Journey. Zelenin and Jimenez in particular, I think are pretty easily the strongest alignment reps that I've seen in how they gradually, very slowly begin to lean one way or the other, and then are eventually pulled a little bit more quickly by entities on either side. But most of it comes from within for them. And really by the time they are 100% agreeing with the side that they're aligning with, it's already too late. But the events and circumstances that take place during this game's story are what push them to those extremes. It's out of necessity, and it's very believable. Like, I buy into these characters' gradual extremism. It actually makes it hard to kind of root for them at that point because they're so extreme in their views. Anyway, you are introduced to a bunch of other characters on the crew. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't give 2 shits about like any of the other characters. I think the portraits in the 3DS version do, I guess, help with making them feel more like characters, but they're equally not as relevant, and plus there's the whole art style thing. It's easy to recognize the gripe people have with the 3DS art style change and how it's like very squeaky clean. I had the same complaint about going from Aria of Sorrow to Dawn of Sorrow in Castlevania, but I don't think it's as cut and dry as a lot of people make it out to be. You might have a preference for one or the other. I do like in the 3DS version how the portraits are more expressive, like there's different portraits for the different emotions that the characters may be conveying. And I guess part of this too is like just the limitations of the visual novel style of this game. Anyhow, the ships make their plunge, but are all thrown off course and lose contact with one another as well as the joint project. And before you can really get your bearings, unidentifiable beings ambush and kill several crew members, upon which you are mysteriously given the demon summoning program, which allows you to identify the assailants as, you may have guessed it, demons. And this basically leaves you and the crew of the Red Sprite to figure out how to survive and escape the Schwarzwelt. Moving into the presentation, I mentioned that this game tells its story in a visual novel style, but this is in addition to the dungeon crawling being in first person, akin to the Super Famicom titles, of course. Whereas something like Nocturne may have had its dungeons kind of designed like a first person dungeon crawler, but you were traversing it in third person though. Now, of course, due to these intentional design decisions, as well as the limitations of the DS, I feel left wanting when it comes to this game's presentation, particularly in the heavier and more implied action-packed moments. I get that with this style of game, you're supposed to kind of fill in the gaps in your head, and it's not that I'm incapable of doing that, but it's more so the way this game's story is told makes it sound much more grand than when you're actually playing it, which makes me really lament that the mainline series went from home consoles to handhelds for so long. While this game was obviously conceptualized as a throwback first-person dungeon crawler, I just feel like there's so much more potential here. All of these narrative aspects are so great on paper, but this presentation really does limit the impact of it on me, even though I can can very much recognize that from a narrative standpoint, this is probably the strongest mainline title I've played. Add to this, the cutscenes were really underwhelming, and more so than that, were very questionable as far as what got the cutscene treatment. If you're going to go all in on the visual novel storytelling, then just do that instead of these cutscenes that don't really show much of anything. It just seemed like a waste of not only development resources, but cartridge space, considering how many key story scenes could have been so much more impactful if they were shown in a cutscene. I get that Atlas was a much smaller entity at the time. This game likely did not have much of a budget at all. It's just like really confusing then why they even allotted any budget to these half-baked cutscenes. Though I will say that despite all of my qualms with the presentation here, the game's still very atmospheric, primarily thanks to the music and just conceptually what the environments are. It very much takes me out of it when I'm walking around and I can only see like 2 or 3 squares in front of me. Again, I get it, hardware limitations and all that. The music, I think, does a lot of the heavy lifting. Of course, Shoji Meguro is a phenomenal composer, though this game's soundtrack is not really his usual style. It's much more orchestral, kind of trying to capture that space opera vibe, but then layered on top of that, in many tracks, you actually have pounding percussion with chanting. It's cool because I kind of view the more symphonic elements as representing the humans and the, I guess, nationalistic, triumphant air that they have going into this mission, with the drums and chanting kind of representing the danger that is present thanks to the demons that are roaming around in the various areas of the Schwarzwald. So that brings me into some of the gameplay aspects. The dungeon crawling is pretty traditional and I would say straightforward generally. The map is automatically generated as you step onto each panel. There are gates that are locked for various purposes, and you slowly gain access to open these gates as you progress. There are pitfall puzzles, floor hazards that either damage you or inflict status on you, one-way doors, etc., etc. There's not anything unique about this game's dungeon crawling, except for the fact that the dungeons just feel very well designed generally. I get a lot of satisfaction of filling out the maps of these various sectors. Now, as you're doing your dungeon crawling, you can find various forma, and this is used in conjunction with Maka, which is the currency, to craft healing items, equipment, as well as various sub-apps that you can toggle on or off on the red sprite or in save rooms. So when it comes to the sub-apps, this is another point similar to the art style change that people take a lot of umbrage with in Redux. In the DS version, these sub-apps have a certain capacity that they take up, and your capacity limit is 10, so you can only have so many of these sub-apps equipped at a time. Whereas in Redux, they removed the capacity limit. Any sub-apps that didn't directly contradict with another could be on all at the same time. I'm gonna be honest, man, I thought the capacity limit was pretty much inconsequential for the vast majority of my playthrough. I felt minimal incentive to mess around with my sub-app loadout unless it was a direct upgrade to one that I had already been using. I typically just stuck with Nurse to make floor hazards less annoying and Relax Spray to help with recruiting demons. Even though I kind of found Negotiation to be not much of a problem, it was kind of predictable since a lot of demons share the questions they ask and the correct answers to said questions based on their personality type. A lot of these personality types tend to come up quite a bit, so it wasn't too hard to like remember which type of demon I was dealing with. Like, do I be a little more cheeky? Do I be a little more serious? It was usually as simple as that, and the Relax Spray just kind of made scouting for correct answers that I didn't know a little bit easier. I don't remember what else I had equipped, but I could heal every couple of steps, or if I need to heal, I just have a heal bot in my party that I never bring into battle, so that way I have MP to heal outside of battle, right? Having a healer that you don't actually use in battle allows you to not burn through a lot of healing items, and therefore allows you to accrue a ton of Maka, which was another thing where I wasn't really left wanting when it came to Maka. I remember in Redux, equipping the sub-apps in that game that allow you to negotiate specifically for Maka as opposed to recruitment. This time around, didn't use those at all, and didn't really run into any roadblocks when it came to that either. The main character in this game is not really a powerhouse in the same way as in other games, partially because you can't spec him specifically. Your stat growths depend on the way you answer the questionnaire at the beginning. It determines if you're a strength-based build or a luck-based build or whatever it might be. I went for strength-based. I just looked up the answers and just picked one. It's one of those things where I think it's cool to kind of base it around this little personality quiz sort of thing, but at the same time, I don't think much would be lost if at the end it was like, you got this build. Would you like to take the test again or just select whatever one you want? I don't feel like much would be lost there personally, but it's a nice bit of flavor at the very least, which I guess gets me into gameplay systems specifically here, where Demon Fusion is Demon Fusion. It largely functions the same, except I want to say if you're just fusing two demons together with no additional stuff going on, the skills that are inherited are set maybe, but usually if I was doing that, it was just fusing away fodder to create more fodder for actual demons that I plan to use. The only time that I really paid much attention to the skills that were being inherited is when I used demon sources, which you acquire from demons when you fully analyze them. And so this is kind of like a lot of other progression systems in JRPGs where you have a secondary experience gauge. It just functions a little bit differently where you can accrue it by fighting against them in addition to with them. I spent a lot of time actually grinding demon sources to give myself more options, but I also didn't end up using the vast majority of the ones I accrued accrued. Quality of life wise, I don't think it would be that busted to just kind of tell you what their demon source contains, or at least be a little more forthcoming with that information, so that the player doesn't either have to look it up or grind out the source only to realize, oh, this is totally useless to me. Because I don't think demons acquire skills from level up in Strange Journey at all, which is kind of interesting. And so like you are heavily incentivized to get these sources and use them, which can be pretty tedious, I'd say. If I wasn't using speed up, I would have literally driven myself insane by doing this. I actually found the combat to be pretty manageable for the most part. I'm trying to think if there were any other bosses that gave me problems aside from RNG and like status BS. I can't really think of many, if any, but I definitely did have to get lucky to some effect for the final boss. I don't really see how you're supposed to beat that final boss without some element of luck on your side. I did Chaos Route, so those of you who played probably know what I was going up against and what the big problem was. There are some ways that you can mitigate the potential bad luck. Really, you just need a run where you don't get insta-killed immediately. One more element of the gameplay that I haven't mentioned is the demon co-op system, which is the aspect that is influenced by your alignment. In the older SMT titles, you could only recruit demons that are of your alignment or neutral. This has not proven to be an issue in any of the games, I don't think, from Nocturne on. Maybe it's a little harder to recruit demons that are outside of your alignment, but are you even distinctly made aware of your alignment in the other games like you are in Strange Journey? Like, Strange Journey changes the color of your character's name to indicate what alignment you currently have because it's so important to the demon co-op system. So because press turn is not a thing in Strange Journey, since this is a throwback title, of course, as opposed to landing a weakness or a critical hit and gaining an extra turn, whenever you do land a weakness or critical hit, any other demons in the active party that share an alignment with the demon that landed said weakness or critical hit will perform a follow-up attack. And so ideally you want a full squad of 4, including the main character, to be all the same alignment. Largely for boss fights, that's what I did do. Though for most dungeon crawling, I was dealing with fodder, trying to grind out demon sources as I progressed and stuff, so it wasn't always totally ideal. It's also one of those elements where even though if I went back and did a law playthrough and therefore would want to use more law demons in boss fights in particular, I really don't think it would change how I play the game all that much, considering I was kind of rocking a mismatched party for a lot of the dungeon crawling sections. And plus I liked going Chaos Route because you get to use the bosses, because they co-op attack with you if you're Chaos aligned, so that's kind of a cool plus, whereas on the law route, I don't know that it would be as interesting in that way. But yeah, overall this game took me around 54 hours according to the in-game timer, but of course I was using speed up for source grinding, so that definitely inflated the time, but then also reloading saves whenever I died would bring that time back a little bit. The number is likely kind of inaccurate, but I feel like those two factors probably balance each other out more than you might think. It's hard to say exactly how much time in real time it actually took me. But yeah, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, I put 40-ish hours into Redux and was like, what, halfway through or something? I don't know that I like Strange Journey so much to want to spend 80 plus hours in a single playthrough on it. There's very few games that I do want to do that with. And so when it comes to Redux specifically, I enjoyed the extra dungeon crawling fine enough. I mean, it's, you know, more of kind of the same. Some of the gimmicks are introduced a little earlier, but I feel like because of that extra dungeon, the game was overstaying its welcome. I guess just to briefly talk about spoilers, I already mentioned that the alignment reps are great, and I really buy into their gradual lean towards the extreme sides of law and chaos. I would say overall, that's probably the strongest aspect of the story, and many of the events in the story are kind of there to facilitate those transformations for them. I will say that certain events towards the back half of the game started to kind of lose me, like when Jack's squad shows up. I like how that eventually facilitates Jimenez's fusion with Bugaboo and extreme chaos outlook and all of that, but Jack's squad as like a story beat, to me at least, feels incongruent a little bit with what had been happening prior. But like I said, I think thematically and for the sake of Jimenez's character, it makes sense and works fine. It's just something that did throw me off, I remember when I was playing Redux at least. I also think that tuxedo gore is kind of dumb. Now look, I wouldn't be as into Japanese games, especially narrative focused ones, if I wasn't prepared for some dumb shit. Gore getting possessed or whatever and leaving after he dies mysteriously is like fine, I guess, but then why does he show up in a tuxedo? Maybe there's some kind of symbolism like, oh, the world's not all black and white like this tuxedo that I'm wearing. And then like he shows you Memelef. Why even include that segment where you go all the way down and you see Memelef and then you leave and then you try to come back and then the elevator's broken, then you have to actually do the dungeon? It makes it feel a little anticlimactic to me. The Easter egg hunt for the cosmic eggs. I get it, symbolism and mythology and all that, but I feel like structurally it's kind of odd. I mean, I do kind of like how the different alignments are holding certain eggs, so you fight certain ones depending on the alignment that you chose. But a lot of those late game story elements were not really my favorite thing ever. Didn't really buy into it as much. I just think that the premise for this game's story is so fucking cool. I think partially because it's so different from the other mainline titles, right? It has nothing to do with Tokyo. You're going into this sort of, I guess, apocalyptic type of setting, but you're trying to prevent it from happening as opposed to investigating after the fact. I really like the symbolism of each sector sort of representing a different deadly sin. I don't know that it necessarily lines up one-to-one, but that kind of thing is pretty cool to me. I know that SMT If does this in a much more direct way, so maybe worth checking out that title at some point in the future. I guess this brings me into the last point that I want to make. It's kind of annoying that they did so many 3DS remasters slash remakes, because those games need to be remastered or remade again because of the fucking 3DS's dual screens and 3D implementation and the UI and the resolution and all this other stuff needs to be reworked and upscaled. I feel like even the 3DS versions leave things wanting as far as presentation is concerned, and so it's kind of a shame they didn't just wait for the Switch or something. Then again, Atlus is releasing their titles multi-platform now, so it would really just be developed with home consoles in mind generally, which for me is a much more positive thing. And B, Atlus re-releases tending to change too much. This has a habit of causing a rift between those who prefer each of the different versions, as we saw with Persona 3. And so this means that regardless of which approach Atlus takes to re-releasing Strange Journey on modern platforms, it's going to guaranteed leave a subsect of the fan base for this game unsatisfied. If they go with a DS version, people who really like Alex and all of the story changes and different endings and stuff are going to be upset about that. And then if they decide to remaster Redux specifically, then all of the people who prefer the DS version are going to feel left out. As with a lot of remaster remake discussion, if you are so satisfied with the original version, I don't think it should really necessarily matter if the remaster or remake is not your cup of tea, because you're already content with playing the original, right? I get that it's an opportunity cost thing, like, well, what if the remake was made specifically to my tastes or whatever? I feel like expecting that and trying to be catered to in such a specific way is pretty entitled. It's just kind of a matter of like luck, I guess, as to whether or not the pros outweigh the cons for you when it comes to how various developers decide to approach certain re-releases or remakes or whatever it might be. I do think that Redux is likely the version that would be easiest to use as a framework for a re-release due to it being more recent. Plus, it does have the most content, even though I don't think that more always equals better when it comes to really anything, but especially video games. It definitely is unfortunate that there may never be a modern way to experience the original story, just with that more fleshed out presentation that I think it deserves. I wouldn't even say that I have major gripes with the Redux story changes and additions. I don't really see so much of that to definitively speak on it. I understand the way that it may undermine certain aspects to the story, but at the same time, like I was saying, the story kind of goes off the rails and is not entirely convincing by the end for me anyway, so it's like, what's one more crazy, stupid time travel bullshit thing, right? I don't necessarily think this game's plot is like a holy grail that cannot be touched or something like that, is what I'm, I guess, trying to say. I also don't think that it makes sense necessarily to do a full-on 3D reimagining of this game, because while that would be cool, I think much of this game's identity lies in its old school roots. And you add to this the implied scale of the locations in this game would maybe require more resources than Atlus would be willing to invest in such a grand project based on such a niche title. One option could be to remaster Redux, since that would be the version that would take the least amount of effort to get functional on modern hardware, I'm guessing, and then later do a grander remake of the original down the road. Another option, of course, would be to bundle both campaigns together, a la Nocturne HD, allowing you to pick between Maniacs and Chronicle, and even Vanilla, at least on PC, or SMT5 Vengeance more recently, with the Canon of Creation and Canon of Vengeance both being included. But that would also require polishing up the original Strange Journey to a point of being on par with Redux. I just don't know if that would make as much sense in this context. I'm not really holding my breath either way. I do like Strange Journey and would love to see it reach a wider audience by being available on more systems. It's just that gripe that I have with a lot of 3DS games, particularly with Atlus. I get that it made sense for them to invest in the 3DS as a platform at the time, but now these games are stranded on a system that is not being supported by Nintendo, in addition to Citra's development being shut down as a casualty of the whole Yuzu debacle. There was still so much more potential there to create an even higher quality experience for these titles, and now the onus is entirely on Atlus to make these games accessible, again, especially for the many people who don't want to emulate to any degree. Although if you're into Megami Tensei in any serious way, you kind of have no choice but to emulate many of the titles in this franchise, which I understand is something that Atlus is slowly remedying. They don't want to just dump everything out all at once, because that just doesn't make much sense. They're going to cannibalize their own sales and attention and all of that. I guess I'm just more curious than anything. The DS version will always be available to play. Redux will always be available to play. So if they take a completely different direction, if they do a 3D remake, if they just remaster Redux, if they just remaster the original, if they remake specifically the original, any of these options I'd be kind of fine with. It's hard to say if I'd replay Strange Journey, as I don't feel like it's quite as flexible as some of the other titles in the series. Not that that's stopped me before with highly linear games, but those games don't tend to be 50+ hours long, with very few exceptions. If anything, I could see myself actually giving Redux another shot, if only to experience something a little bit different. Going through this specific version of Strange Journey for a second time doesn't sound like super compelling to me. Go ahead and let me know what y'all think about Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey. Have you played it? Which version do you prefer? Is the disdain towards Redux overblown? I certainly think so, but I do understand why some people feel the way that they do. Next up for me is doing a video on Shin Megami Tensei 4, which I've already finished and have have quite a bit to say about. And of course, once I eventually finish SMT5 Vengeance, I will be talking about that, I'm sure, at length. Any potential plans following that, I will save for discussion at a later date. Thank you guys for bearing with me. I know this video was maybe a little bit more on the rambly sort of side than, at the very least, I had initially intended. I do, of course, want to thank my channel members, and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.